Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. My name is Levon Williams. My pronouns are he, him. Welcome to the Collective Liberation Disrupt, Dismantle, and Manifest Conference. Hope that if this is your first day, welcome. And if you were here yesterday, thanks so much for joining us. And hope you really found the conference so far to just be something good, something needed for you. And it certainly was for me yesterday. Before each of our sessions, we are very, very mindful and intentional about creating a space and a moment for reflection as we go into the space. Many of us, including myself, we're doing something right before this. And we want to make space for each of us to focus and really take in what our presenter has for us this afternoon. And so we are asking that as part of that moment of reflection, you think about all of the intersectional privilege that you have and that has brought you here today, including the land that you are currently on. We are coming to this conference from many different spaces. So we invite you to take a moment to just reflect on your life and what has allowed you to be in this space with us right now, including the land that you are currently occupying. Thank you. You may have already seen our programming schedule, but just a quick reminder, this session is limitation on traditional funding models, and we also have 3 other sessions in store today. I am happy to introduce our speaker for the hour, Camille-Mary, and I'm going to hand it off to her, but I also want to acknowledge our ASL interpreters who are here with us as well. So thank you so much for being here. Camille-Mary, I will pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Levon. Okay, just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Okay. Can everyone hear me properly as well? Okay, I'll assume yes. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for this session on funding. So I intentionally made this presentation quite broad since everyone's funding experiences are likely very different, and to kind of go over some of the main significant issues that I think relate to funding practices in museums. So as Levon mentioned, my name is Camille-Mary. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. And before we get started, I do have some community responsibilities to attend to. So I am a French-born settler living, studying, and working in Toronto, Canada, or Takaranto, meaning the place in the water where there are trees standing in Kanyenkeha. This area is Indigenous land, which has long been cared for by the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This land is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which ensures the peaceful caring and sharing of the region around the Great Lakes. And today, Takaranto is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. The next part of my acknowledgement could be extremely triggering to some Indigenous attendees, so I just want to give a brief content warning. Okay, so this past week has been incredibly difficult for Indigenous peoples in Canada who are mourning 215 Indigenous children whose remains were found in an unmarked mass grave at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops, Teshequepem territory. This nearly unspeakable atrocity is the direct result of the colonialism of the Canadian state in collaboration with various churches. Even though anti-Indigenous racism and colonialism remain alive and well in so-called Canada today, and indeed the last residential school actually closed in the 90s, There are still numerous politicians and journalists and influential people here who deny such atrocities and who insist on celebrating the founding fathers of this country. So with that, I really want to honor the memory of these children. I want to send thoughts to the Indigenous families who are still looking for missing loved ones. I want to echo calls for the federal government to investigate all former residential school sites as well as their employees. And I hope that we can reflect on the truly heavy and significant implications of doing these land acknowledgements. Lastly, like I mentioned, I am from the University of Toronto, and it is my duty to communicate that the university is currently under censure by the Canadian Association of University Teachers after it was revealed that the hiring of a scholar was interrupted by an influential donor because of that scholar's critical research on human rights in Israel and Palestine. So I encourage you to read more about the situation at censureuoft.ca. And I just want to say that all of these issues are very much connected as they represent the ongoing violence and oppression of settler colonial states. And I do truly hope that you'll join me in promoting anti-colonial and anti-racist solidarity across borders. Oh, and I do want to acknowledge and thank the numerous people behind the scenes who have been working to make this event happen, including but not limited to Levon, Agnesa, Elizabeth, Stephanie, and Sarah. Thank you also to the other presenters who are generously sharing their knowledge and sometimes traumatic experiences with us in the other sessions. And of course, a huge shout out to the community of people who continue to support me and inspire me, like my doctoral supervisor, my mentors, and my colleagues. So again, thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for joining me. Okay, I think we can get started. Okay, so I just want to start by telling you a little bit about me and what I do. So I'm a PhD researcher, and I've been researching funding in Canadian institutions for nearly 5 years now. More specifically, I'm writing my dissertation on 2 museums in Canada that have been sponsored by or are currently sponsored by oil companies and who have faced some resistance and activism over those partnerships as early as 1988 to today. So I spent time conducting archival research and doing interviews with people in these institutions to kind of try to untangle a little bit the contradictions and the realities of oil sponsorship in museums. But today I'm not going to talk to you in detail about those 2 institutions so much, but it's really something that I'm happy to answer questions about or talk to you about at the end if you have questions about that. So I started doing this research after I completed a master's in museum studies, and I felt like during the master's, I did not see a lot of material or readings about funding in museums. And this was also around the time that there was kind of an increase in anti-oil protests in museums, especially European museums, like the Tate and the British Museum in the UK, but also the Louvre and the Van Gogh Museum in the Netherlands. So all this to say that, full disclosure, I am a researcher, not a funding professional. But I think that being on the outside of institutions has given me a little bit of freedom to talk about funding and sponsors in a critical way. Because as we know, these can be difficult conversations to have sometimes within institutions. And lastly, I know I'm talking probably to a primarily American audience. So I just want to say there are definitely differences between the Canadian and the American context of museums and cultural organizations in general. But a theme that I'm going to return to is the need for specificity in these discussions around funding, as well as in our pathways forward that we can think up together. But even within kind of a singular national context, there can be countless differences between institutions, how they get funded, by whom, and especially what kind of flexibility or lack thereof that they might have in resisting or changing some of their funding models or relationships. And of course, I do focus primarily on sponsorship from extractive industries. But again, I think that if we approach this conversation broadly, while emphasizing the need for institutional specificity when you're doing this work in your own organization, I think that's a good starting point. And speaking of starting points, I think a good way to begin to look at funding issues in institutions is to go back in time a little bit and identify some contentious moments. Okay, so this is a photo of artists who are getting ready to protest an exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is in Toronto in 1976. The exhibit in question was called Changing Visions, the Canadian Landscape, and it was sponsored by Reed Paper, which is a paper company that was making their paper through the sourcing of pulp that was being produced in a pulp plant, which in the 1960s and 70s actually dumped about 10 metric tons of mercury into the Wabigoon River, which contaminated the water and the fish that the Grassy Narrows First Nation and the Wabasamong Nation depend on. And serious health effects from this mercury contamination remain today. So these artists were demanding at the time that the AGO, the art gallery, drop Reed Paper as their sponsor. The next one is one that you might be a bit more familiar with. So this is Hans Hack's institutional critique of mobile sponsorship of the Metropolitan Museum from 1985. So Mobile at the time was operating in apartheid South Africa. They were actively supporting the apartheid regime by funding some of the military forces there. And this work of Hack was exhibited at the New Museum in New York. And there was another oil company that was complicit in South African apartheid in the 80s, and that was Shell. And Shell in 1988 sponsored an exhibition at the second museum that I researched as part of my dissertation, the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, Alberta. So in 88, the Glenbow put on pretty significant exhibition of Indigenous artwork and Indigenous material culture. It was also affiliated with the Calgary Olympics, and Shell sponsored that exhibition, and there was a big controversy and an international boycott as a result, because at the time Shell was also illegally drilling in the unceded territories of the Lubicon Cree in northern Alberta. And so here you have Anishinaabeg artist Rebecca Belmore's work titled Artifact Number 671B. And you can see Belmore here is kind of trying to represent herself as an artifact and attaching what she kind of refers to as a museum label that has the Shell logo on it. And this photo was taken in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Okay, so why am I showing you this? Basically, I'm starting with this history because I want to say that artists, activists, and museum workers have been critiquing corporate sponsorship for a really long time. These conversations are not new. And today we're still very much grappling with this contradiction between kind of our progressive aims, decolonization frameworks, environmental justice frameworks, and the reality that museums are still very much embedded in the reproduction of elite and corporate power. And I also want to point out that this history is important to keep in mind and to highlight because sometimes, especially today, elites tend to try to resist calls for change by maybe alluding to some concepts like cancel culture, things like that, which we know, are not real or not true, because as we can see with this history, people have taken issue with corporate funding for a very long time. So these are not kind of new calls to cancel anything. There's a rich history here. And a couple of theories, I mean, not really theories, these can be a bit evident, but some thoughts as to why it's taken us so long and we're still dealing with these kinds of contradictions and still dealing with these issues. First, as you probably very well know, we're very dependent on funding. Museums are very dependent on funding, and there's sometimes the feeling that institutions can't be picky. And the second thought I have around this is that funding, like I kind of mentioned earlier, has not been a very popular topic of study in museums, especially in the last few decades when critical frameworks of decolonization, of environmental justice have been highlighted in the museum field and in scholarship. It's really the curatorial work of museums that has been most talked about and critiqued, or like conservation or access. Basically, like material or object-based practices in museums are the ones that have been kind of the primary focus of decolonization efforts. And this is not without good reason. So, with object-based reforms, they can feel more tangible, right? So where you can sometimes see or feel the progress directly. So let's say, through the repatriation of artifacts to their home communities. So yeah, in those kinds of instances, the connections between museums and kind of entanglement in colonialism is more obvious. But I do want to, part of what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to highlight that these connections also exist when we think about funding. They just need to be deconstructed a little bit and talked about, and sometimes perhaps even feel helpless about. But that's why I'm here. And that's what I want to do today, to kind of really kick off a critical conversation about funding in museums, one that recognizes and honors and tries to learn from this rich history of resistance. Because at the end of the day, museums are the sum of their practices, and that includes funding. So this is where I'm a little bit curious about who's in the audience. So we'll have a Zoom poll going in just a second. I would love to know if you engage in funding related activities in your work. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer that poll. Oh, the second question was meant for later, but that's okay. I see some eager beavers that are already answering the second question. That's great. Okay, so we have a majority of sometimes, which makes sense. That's great. Thank you. Okay. So this is good to know. So let's break down funding a little bit. So what is funding? So I've kind of broken down in my research funding as being comprised of four main components. The first is government support, and this is usually various levels of governments will provide museums with often like their operating funds. The second is private donations. So this is like just donations from private wealthy individuals. Then we have foundation grants, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with because you have to apply for them all the time from various kind of arts and culture-focused foundations. And then finally, the one that is most often critiqued by activists and the one that I focus on in my research is corporate sponsorship. So you might have noticed that maybe there is a missing fifth component here, which is revenue. So I just want to explain why I didn't put revenue on here. So I consider revenue, and by revenue I mean like funds that the museum gets from admissions, for example, visitor admissions, or from facility rentals. So I consider this more of a self-sustaining revenue stream for museums rather than an external source of funding. Not to say that revenue should not be part of this conversation and the growing conversations around this. It absolutely should be. But I just wanted to say why I didn't put it here. So as many of you know, I guess, according to this poll, each of these 4 areas requires a special set of expertise, from conducting research to navigating relationships with donors, to communications around marketing and development as well, to writing successful grant proposals. And these are different if you're doing a sponsorship proposal or a proposal like a grant application from a foundation. There's different components there, to reading and understanding complex legal contracts, unless you maybe work at a really large organization and then you have somebody whose job is just to read all the contracts. And of course, these all depend on your organization and its financial context and its size. But all these things are kind of central to the work of museums, and this is why they need to be talked about more. So this absence of funding related practices in museums, and in scholarship particularly, because we know that activists and organizations like Strike MoMA and Decolonize This Place are out there doing the work to highlight and critique some aspects of certain institutions' funding and sponsorship in particular, and board of trustees as well. But there's an absence in the literature, at least from my perspective. And this has led to what I see as kind of a huge disconnect between funding and the critical frameworks that have informed the important transformations, or at the very least, if you don't like that word, reforms of museums since at least the 1970s, from like incorporating different ways of learning to increasing access opportunities to communities, incorporating Indigenous knowledge, and trying to create relationships with communities and be at the service of communities that we as institutions have done the most harm to. So I'm not seeing a lot of funding related questions in those critical frameworks. And so here is where I want to know, and maybe we can relaunch the second poll here, why we're not practicing what we preach around anti-oppression and decolonization when it comes to funding in museums, or better yet, have we practiced what we preach? What are we doing right now? So I would love to know if you answered yes or sometimes on the first poll, if your organization has a funding related policy or philosophy. And if you can, if you want, you can anonymously kind of give us an example of that in the collaborative Padlet that's being shared in the chat. So I'll give you a couple minutes and I'll have a sip of water. Okay, I've opened the Padlet so I can see what people are saying. So far, not much. That's okay, take your time. We can always revisit it at the end as well. But we're doing okay on time, so no rush. Oh, and I will answer a question that I see in the chat while you're doing that. I believe that was Chelsea's question. Okay, so lots of different policies, but no coherent policy or no coherent philosophy, no stated philosophy, but it was clearly about currying favor with individuals. Okay. Okay, that's great. So I'm going to return to this Padlet at the end, but thank you so much for sharing that with us. So yeah, this kind of brings me back to my question of why is funding or why has funding not really been incorporated into discussions of decolonization and environmental sustainability in museums, or at least not as much as collections-based practices. So for me, this reflects one of the main disconnects between the institutional appropriation of decolonization and its actual intended meaning, which, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang reminded us in their essential essay in 2012, that decolonization is not a metaphor and that it entails the return of the land to communities. So as museums, and especially the museums with walls, which are actively kind of sitting on sometimes unceded lands, or who regularly receive funding from industries, especially extractive industries, who themselves are actively displacing people. And this is especially prominent in the mining industry in South Africa and Latin America. The question of land is something that we really need to grapple with mindfully in this conversation as well. And these kinds of disconnects, co-optation, appropriation, these are themes that often recur in these discussions and in my research. And they can be, to be honest with you, they can be completely demotivating. But that does not mean that we should shy away from them. So, and I'll get back to this a little bit at the end, but there's a similar disconnect between, for example, the radical aims of environmental justice, which, as we know, entails racial justice, and the capitalistic appropriation of sustainability, especially sustainability discourse, which is kind of taking our global transition to renewable energy as a new way of making profit, and which is replicating the magnitude of environmental destruction by the oil industry, replicating the oppressive, discriminatory treatment of racialized workers, and is replicating the displacement of indigenous peoples. So why is funding important to understand within these contexts and frameworks? So there are two things. The first is the history of corporate wealth in the cultural sector. So corporate wealth and cultural organizations are so deeply entangled from their very beginnings. And a good example of this, which brings us back again to oil wealth, is that, for example, oil billionaires like Rockefeller and Carnegie have founded numerous cultural initiatives all across North America, in Canada as well, even though they're American. They have here, they've also been very influential in the early founding of universities. They've influenced cultural policy in both countries. And then we can also see this entangled history in the beginnings of museums themselves. So if I tell you a little bit about the two institutions that I research, the first is the Canadian Museum of History, and which got in a little bit of heat a few years ago for its sponsorship by an oil organization. But if we go all the way back to the beginnings of that museum was actually started from the collection of the Geological Survey of Canada, which was a group of geologists in early Canada who were kind of tasked by the government to go identify potential areas in so-called Canada to extract mineral wealth. And so when they were doing all of that surveying, they, of course, found lots of mineral specimens, artifacts, human remains, and they basically developed this collection that then was turned into a museum. So you can see how extraction here is very much deeply rooted in this cultural institution. The second museum that I research is the Glenbow, like I mentioned, in Calgary, Alberta. And that museum was founded by a lawyer who invested in an oil well and amassed a lot of wealth, and then started collecting a lot of Canadian art, Indigenous art and settler art, and then eventually opened this museum called the Glenbow. So again, another example of the importance of kind of tracing back the history to take a look at this entanglement. And then the second point that I wanted to mention here is strategy. So I'm sure you all know this, but it's good to talk about it. So companies fund nonprofit organizations and initiatives to enact their social license. And so what does that mean? So social license means gaining and sustaining the kind of broad public approval for a company's operations. And this is no secret in the business world. All corporations practice this. They set aside a pool of funds for this, and there's endless business and marketing literature and research around this if you want to look more into that. So this idea of social license has existed in resource extraction industries for many decades. It emerged from heightened critiques over the social and environmental impacts of mining and fossil fuel operations. And there's kind of two main obvious or measurable impacts of this social license when we're thinking about corporate sponsorship in museums that come to mind. The first is visual branding, right? So if a company is sponsoring an exhibition in the museum, for example, they'll make sure that their logo is on all the interpretive materials, or at least a lot of the interpretive materials. And this is kind of an advertisement strategy. And then the second kind of obvious thing that we can think about here is tax cuts from the government, which is also kind of a form of social license, where the government is saying, yeah, keep doing your thing as long as you give a portion of your profits to not-for-profit institutions. So more recently, this kind of corporate social responsibility strategy by companies, as well as the kind of philanthropic work of large foundations, have been characterized as philanthropy capitalism. And this is where why I put this, one of my favorite scenes from a show I like a lot, Mad Men, and the character Bert Cooper here says, philanthropy is the gateway to power. This is after he's trying to convince the main character of the show to become a director on the board of the Met. So what is philanthropy capitalism? Thank you for bearing with me with these concepts. So this is a term that kind of suggests our reliance as a society on billionaires' charity to support public projects. And this kind of tries to resolve this contradiction between charity, which is traditionally focused on giving, and capitalism, which is basically based on the pursuit of economic self-interest. And it also, philanthropy capitalism is also kind of based on the claim that capitalism is superior to all other systems, especially government, when it comes to not only creating economic, but also human progress, and that the market is, or should be made, the primary creator of a good society, a good and equal society. But more broadly, philanthropy and philanthropy capitalism kind of serves to legitimize capitalism and to extend it into all domains of life, social, cultural, and political activity. And there's a sociologist named Aileen Ross, who I'd like to quote here very briefly. And she wrote that philanthropy has always been the reflection of a class society because it has depended on a division between rich givers and poor recipients. The wealthy have not only given because they have more, but because by alleviating distress, they have secured their own position against those they displace and have thus avoided revolution. So other people have also argued that philanthropy has been used to kind of monitor and control social justice movements, to manage and control dissent in order to make the world safe for capitalism, to allow corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial practices, and also to kind of encourage social movements to model themselves after capitalist structures rather than challenge them. So again, we're going back to this sense of discouragement, and we can feel helpless in the face of these very large scale, global and complex networks of power that circulate from capital to our institutions. And it can feel very difficult to develop policy or organize resistance around something that is so vague. So I find it helpful to actually break down the ways that corporate sponsors circulate power and legitimize themselves. And so before I move on to the next slide, I do want to say that in the media and sometimes in informal discussions, we can often think about some of these effects as, you know, fears over censorship of content. But I found that in my research, the effects of sponsorship in institutions are not so much related to censorship, which is what a lot of media coverage around these issues would have us think. And this is not without reason. So for example, in Canada, I guess a decade ago now, we had a controversy over our Canadian Museum of Science and Technology that developed an energy themed exhibition, and it was sponsored by Imperial Oil, and emails were leaked that revealed that there was some sponsor influence on the contents of the show. But from my research, I found that there is policy around content or contract clauses around content, and that many museums already have these. And this is a policy that all museums should already have. And this is kind of related to, for example, that donors or sponsors are not allowed to view content before it's finalized. But so moving on from censorship, these are the four other strategies that I've kind of identified as the ways that social license is broken down in museums through corporate sponsorship. So like I mentioned a bit earlier, visual branding is a main component of how corporate sponsors enact their social license in museums by advertising their logos on museum materials. But there's also some other components. So access. So sponsors gain access to exclusive events with political elites. And a good example of this is, again, the main museum from my research, the Canadian Museum of History. By reading through emails between their oil sponsor at the time and the museum, it was very clear that the oil sponsor was interested in sponsoring this museum because of its close proximity to our parliament, which is our government, and that way it could have access to a lot of political elites and influence their decisions around basically policies around resource extraction in Canada. So that was the main motivation of this partnership. And that's why I've identified access as an important one. The second is data. So museums do share demographic data about their visitors with corporate sponsors. And this is done usually during the proposal process. So before an agreement is actually reached, where sponsors, before they agree, they really want to know or figure out if the demographics of an institution's visitors align with the communities that they're trying to reach. And finally, another one that folks may be familiar with is governance, where museums often give board positions, which comes with influence on museum decisions, to corporate executives in exchange for large donations. And I'm pretty sure in the US context, this usually takes the form of like someone will give a very large donation to start, and that gets them a seat at the table, somewhere in the several millions, depending on how big the institution is. And then after that, the individual would pay a smaller amount every year to retain their seat at the table. And so again, this one brings us back to the tax cuts, because this is how wealthy elites can kind of wash their profits through the nonprofit sector. And so I am noting the time. So it's difficult to organize resistance around this because every organization likely has a different funding model and a different economic context. And so much like the great local context presentation from yesterday, in these conversations, we really need specificity, local specificity. And this kind of brings me back to the second institution that I researched, the one in Calgary, Alberta. If you sent a group of activists there who are pressuring the museum to divest from their oil sponsors, the museum just would close because, as you may know, Calgary is basically an oil center. Oil is its primary economy. So everybody who has money in Calgary and who helps fund the museum comes from oil. So this kind of strategy just wouldn't work in that context. And many people could probably say, well, yeah, close the museum then. And hey, I don't disagree, but let's keep going. So these four effects that I mentioned, they're why we need to think more critically about funding. We need to open this dialogue. We need to open lines of communication between activists and institutions. We need to do more research about what's actually going on in funding. We need to consider funding professionals in museums as museum professionals, right? We need to pay attention to their work and connect their work to broader discussions and frameworks. So, while I am very pro-divestment, and I believe that activist pressure is a necessary part of cultural work, it pushes progress forward, it's a foundational aspect of a democratic society, I think that as museum professionals, we need to think beyond divestment as a singular long-term strategy. And the other reason I'm a little critical of divesting from specific industries without first putting in place robust frameworks and policies around funding is that, if we're being honest, there's no such thing as ethical sponsorship under capitalism. And I know many of us are excited about divesting from fossil fuels, myself included, and are excited about the global transition to renewable energy. But it's important to think about the way that the media and corporations, and sometimes even activist groups, frame the fossil fuel industry as the main evil, the main antagonist that needs to be defeated through divestment. And again, I support this, but I just think we need to think beyond divestment and more into the future. So the reason I'm saying this, I mean, there's many reasons, but mostly because many scholars have pointed to the ways that this transition to renewable energy, which is kind of culturally supported by climate change and divestment discourses, it remains rooted in extractivist modes of production like mining, where mining companies, which are already incredibly wealthy due to electronics, right? The chips in our phones and computers, they are engaged in numerous ongoing human rights abuses, corporate colonialism, and environmental destruction in sourcing and producing the metals that fuel renewable energy. Such as lithium-powered batteries in cars. And it's important for me to emphasize this because from a Canadian research perspective, 60% of the world's mining companies are Canadian. And they gather every year in Toronto every March to discuss their next strategies to mine as many resources as possible in mostly Latin American and African countries. And so with this in mind, I think that extractive capitalism, which basically is comprised of all the destructive effects of our political, social, and economic dependency on like resource extraction, I think this will extend strategies of cultural and ideological legitimation that basically corporate sponsorship tries to do beyond our global divestment from oil and fossil fuels. So I think there's an urgent need for us to really understand and deconstruct how this cultural legitimacy through corporate sponsorship is achieved, regardless of industry. And so I know this can feel very discouraging, and I am keeping an eye on the time, and I'm nearly done, I promise. But as we know, especially through these amazing forums like Collective Liberation, museum professionals are so passionate and so keen, and I don't think that there's anything that we can't tackle. So kind of going back to a previous slide, what frameworks, what policies, what understandings can we start to put in place so that we can deal with corporate sponsorship as a whole? And be critical of the industries that will undoubtedly take the place of companies like oil as sponsors of culture once we have divested from fossil fuels. So finally, some concrete steps that we can take to do this. So first, just start, let's try to understand. This is primarily what I'm trying to do through my research, is understanding what's going on. So research your own organization's ties to industries through annual reports, financial statements, which are all available to the public. You can also look at all the donor plaques around your institution. The second pathway that I've identified is making things visible. So start a dialogue about funding in your institution. And I know this is not possible for everyone. So, you can pick and choose of these four. You don't have to consider them all together. And you can also visualize financial partnerships through corporate mapping. And I'll show you what that looks like as an appendix at the end. But corporate mapping basically is the process of mapping the circulation of corporate power and influence in society. And I use a great tool called littlesis.org, which is kind of like it's like a Wikipedia. It's public, it's free, and basically you can go in and add your own institution or organization's ties to certain influential people or corporations, and then create maps to see what that looks like. So I'm a big fan of this tool. Lastly, or no, not lastly, thirdly, connect your organization's mission and values to practices of funding and development, and also connect our critical frameworks of decolonization and anti-oppression to these issues as well, right? Like, I hope I made clear, funding should not be isolated from these conversations. And lastly, this is where I don't have an answer for you, but I'm really hoping to start that conversation and hear from all you brilliant people. We need to start thinking outside the box in terms of funding models and imagine more community-based funding and governance models. So the appendix I was telling you about, oops, sorry, I guess my slide got a little bit messed up. The title should not be on the map, but anyways, so this is a map that I started that starts to kind of look at all the extractive industries and influential people that fund Canadian museums. So I'm just showing this to you for fun, so you can see what corporate mapping can look like. And there's a link to this map so you can see it more clearly on this resource list, which is also going to be shared with hyperlinks and everything in the chat for you. So with that, I think I'm done. I wish you all a very beautiful and self-reflective Pride Month and Indigenous History Month. And thank you so much for listening.
Wow, Camille-Mary, that was just so incredible. Lavon, I apologize. I was in charge of taking notes and I just kind of stopped halfway through because I just sat there just absorbing it. It was, I think you've done such a beautiful job of creating some complexity around a very complex topic. And then just at the end, making it really visible that the work is about making this visible and discontinuing the obfuscation of these practices. So I guess I'm curious to you, we have a couple of questions in the chat. First, Latanya is asking if you can share the name of the author and book you cited around Philanthropy Capitalism.
Oh yeah, so Philanthropy Capitalism, there's lots of great, I think there's a great article in The Guardian. You know what, I'm just gonna, because it's not on my resource list, Latanya, I'm just gonna find it and share it. But then the author that I did mention is Aileen Ross, who is no longer with us. But let me just find the article. There we go, it's called The Trouble with Charitable Billionaires. Here we go, I'll share it. And if it's possible, can we also share the resource list? I had a PDF.
Yeah, I dropped that in the chat. I will just pop
Okay.
that back in here.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Because that has all the links that are, here, I'll share my screen again. Yeah.
Excellent. And then how do you, so I think you broke down really well the corporate, the benefits of corporate donations. How do you differentiate between corporate and private donations, given that many of our organizations are predominantly supported by individual donors?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, I do have to say that private donations is not my area of expertise. I mostly look at oil sponsorship. But there, I think the main thing, and it kind of, if we go back to, if we go back here, the main thing with private donations, I think would be related to the tax cuts that I mentioned, and to governance. So I think we definitely need to also develop policies around private donations, but it's very different kind of system than corporate sponsorship. But that doesn't mean that you know, the legitimation of that person's wealth is not happening through private donations. And I personally, you know, I would love to hear feedback about that. And we definitely need to develop, and especially also I think with developing policies around, for example, who has access to content before it's finalized. So in my research, I've been told that the museums that I research do have policies that prevent sponsors and donors from seeing content before it's finalized. But that's like a best case scenario because as I mentioned, that example from 10 years ago, there was sponsor interference. So how do we make policies really robust for both private donors and corporate sponsorships? That's a great question. And I maybe if somebody's an expert in private donations can help us out in the chat as well.
I'm curious about, so you and I were in a session right before this where we were talking about systems we wanted to dismantle in museums, and the idea of this sort of bending over backwards for funders came up from one of the attendees, and he brought in the idea of evaluation. So I'm curious about when you're talking about the data we share with corporations, has your research gone into, you know, this idea of how we make things visible? How could we use tools like evaluation and data gathering to do some of this, making it visible so that we're not continually bending to the whim of a funder?
No, that's a great question. Another thing that I've noticed that I don't focus on, but I would love to read more about it or maybe do this for another project, is how our visitors, how the communities that we serve perceive corporate sponsorship. And so there's not a lot of information out there about that. There's not a lot of studies about that. And I think that is so important. And I think about, you know, not bending over backwards. This is where policy comes into place, right? And this is where starting the dialogue, because I think part of our issue, and this makes sense that we haven't talked about it so much, is because, you know, we can't be picky with these things. People can be scared for their jobs, which is terrible and should not happen. But we really need to start this dialogue so that museum professionals can start to feel more comfortable developing policy or saying, hey, yeah, we would love this money, but you're not, you know, you're not allowed to have a say in this, or, you know, things like that. I don't know if that answers the question.
That's great. And Anissa, thank you. Anissa just added the Ask and Offer doc into the chat, because this is just, I think, a conversation that is on so many of our minds. I had some of my colleagues from MIA here today. I know it's on a lot of our minds. So if you're interested in continuing the conversation, please add your name there. And Samantha, thank you for offering to talk about individual donors. Okay,
yes,
you have
Samantha is a colleague of mine, and you can chat with Samantha Summers about individual donors as well.
That's great. Okay, you have a challenging question in the Q&A that just came in. How do you feel about selling art from collections as a source of alternative funding?
Who are we selling them to? Yeah, I mean, I'm not that familiar with, the contemporary art market. I'm more familiar with history collections and anthropological collections. And so my first thought to that is, who are we selling this to? We need to actually return all collections to their communities first. But I mean, I don't, again, I'm not an expert in this, but that doesn't sound like such a bad idea if it's very, like, I think another way of thinking about this is, like, if you have a super valuable contemporary artwork, or like a Picasso or something, is this actually important to the community that you serve as a museum? Because if it's not, yes, sell it for millions of dollars. I am very pro that.
That's great. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Like, who are we selling it to? Are we selling it to someone who's using it to amass, more generational wealth? So that's a great follow-up question. I love, again, this sort of problematizing the problem that you're doing. This next question that came in, I think, is really related to the previous question around how we can use evaluation, because the idea of museum staff reacting to sponsorship and doing their work differently, even if the sponsor is not actively trying to influence an exhibit or programming, we sort of know that it's there, and maybe we're kind of subconsciously trying to shift our behaviors or our decisions. So I'm wondering if you've looked into that at all.
I have not really looked into that. And it's kind of interesting because when I first started doing this research, the big two kind of keywords, buzzwords, and issues were censorship and self-censorship. And even when I started conducting interviews in these institutions, right away, I think some museum professionals were I think they were maybe feeling a little bit defensive, and they right away would think that I'm asking about self-censorship or like influence on content and things like that. And in my research, I was more kind of interested in just breaking down. And again, this comes from the gap in the literature about this, that I really could find very little scholarship and writing and research about what is actually happening through sponsorship in museums. So my research kind of started with these very broad political questions around censorship and self-censorship that were kind of very much inspired by some activist groups. And then it kind of had to become a lot more bare bones and just, hey, tell me what's going on. Like, how does sponsorship work? What's happening with this exhibition? And I have not found much evidence, but maybe because I haven't been looking for that or theorized that as much, it just became really kind of impossible for me to ignore the much more political, especially with the Canadian Museum of History, the much more political aims that the sponsor had, and getting access to government officials through their sponsorship. But that's definitely another thing where we need a lot of literature on this, and a lot more research on this. And actually, there is an article that comes to mind about self-censorship. Just give me a second to find it, and I'll share it.
This is great. I'm thinking like how simultaneously we're able to work in Zoom, have a conversation, share resources. I'm kind of curious whenever we're kind of approached with a complex issue like this, I kind of envision like a Jenga stack of those little wood sticks, cubes, blocks, to try and feel like we could move first, which will be structurally kind of the most impactful in bringing the whole tower down. So I'm curious, I mean, you showed us a really great slide of sort of suggestions you have for how to move ahead. I'm curious, when you're thinking about this work, where do you feel hopeful, dare I even say? Where do you feel like the most impact can be made in making an impact?
That's a great question. Thanks, Elizabeth. I feel most hopeful when I'm participating in these kinds of discussions. Last year, I had the amazing opportunity to chat with people at Death to Museums as well about these issues. And just the fact that we're all gathering with these really radical aims in mind to dismantle and manifest, I think that's so amazing. And I feel hopeful even being able to have this platform to start this conversation. And again, I think we just need to start directing our critical values, our critical frameworks, our critical reforms that are currently keeping museums afloat to these issues as well. And the fact that so many people are interested in this and have been asking wonderful questions, that makes me very hopeful. So like I said, I know a lot of the things that I mentioned can feel really discouraging, right? Like, capitalism is evil. There's no such thing as ethical sponsorship. I felt this so many times in my work. But I think you're all just, you're the evidence that we can move forward with this. Museum professionals are just so motivated and passionate. So I don't know. I think y'all are the ones that keep me hopeful.
Thank you so much. I totally agree. There's such hope in us gathering together. So I hope that we can continue these conversations. I know those of us who are part of the mass action movement are continuing to have these conversations. Folks are adding their information into the Ask and Offer. So I hope this is just one step on a very long journey together. Levon, I'm going to bring you back on, and we will thank our speaker, Camille-Mary, our interpreters, Sarah and Stephanie, our tech hosts, Anissa and Paula, and thank all of you for being here. This was a great conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, Levon, I just wanted to say thank you so much, and thank you to the interpreters as well.
No problem, Camille-Mary. I just wanted to check in with you. Was there anything on the Padlet that you wanted to return to before we wrap up? We wrap.
Oh my gosh, I completely forgotten about the Padlet. Here we go.
Forgotten too, just until a second ago. So.
Oh, this is so great. This is great stuff. Thank you, everyone who participated on here. Yeah, no, I don't think I'll get back to anything. I'm kind of exhausted right now, but I'm definitely going to keep these in mind. So, and thank you very much to everybody who participated.
Yep, I'll go.
And people should take a screenshot if they want.
I'm gonna give a couple seconds for that, for anyone who might want to take a screenshot, and we can put the link back in the chat too, if that would be helpful for folks. All right. Thank you all again for joining us for this session, this afternoon session. We do have another session coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And that one is, oh, sorry, taking a sec for that to pop up. And that will be Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is, a critical look at co-creation and collaboration beyond the buzzwords. And we're excited about that. Again, thank you all for making the time and being present. And thank you for everyone on the back end who has helped make this happen. Have a great afternoon.